The June Joust Tournament is completed, and this one had it all. Plenty of upsets, a majority of the games going 3-0, all leading to the closest grand finals we've seen in a while, and the crowning of the champion of the June Joust. Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Doles, and welcome to the Overwatch League Weekly Recap. In this video, we're going to be going over the matches from the June Joust, including the knockouts in both divisions, and looking at how my predictions I made before the knockouts, and then before the Final Four teams played, measure up to the action. As such, there is a full spoiler warning for the knockouts and the final tournament, so if you haven't seen them, you may want to watch those before watching this video. But before we get into the games, we do have a little bit of roster changes to go through. Starting off, the Shanghai Dragons have added DPS player Develop to the team. Now, I've not looked into this individual player yet, but Develop does play the hit scan role, and so I believe this is a pickup to replace Diem, who retired a couple of weeks ago. Now, given that Shanghai have been playing mostly Fleta and Lip, unless there is a need for a double hit scan that doesn't include a hero Fleta can play, which is unlikely, I don't expect to see Develop all that much, so it's not that big of a deal. Next, both the Toronto Defiant and London Spitfire have made changes of contracts to the two of their players. Toronto putting Aspire on the inactive list and loaning him to the American Tornado Contenders team, and London placing Hybrid on a two-way contract to allow him to play with the British Hurricane, the London's contender team. Now, I don't know if this will affect much, but for Toronto's case, I expect that we'll see Hisu and Logic's return from after being sick, though I still hope that Toronto will sign Aspire permanently, just because of how good he's looked in the few games he's played. As for Hybrid in the London Spitfire, Hybrid will still be able to play in OW, but I'm not entirely sure how the two-way contracts works. I've never looked into that too much, but given that contenders just finished their tournaments this month, and the league is on a bye week, I don't expect this to make too much of a difference. The Chengdu Hunters are also making some changes, demoting DPS player Kaneki to the Hunters contender team, Team Chaser, and promoting Taro Cookie from the same team to replace him. Now this is a bit of an interesting change, as Kaneki is more of a projectile DPS, while Taro Cookie is a hit scan player. But to be fair, the Hunters currently have both Leave and Jinmu on their roster, both of which are great projectile players, and while we really only saw Kaneki for most of the June Joust playing the Reaper, I don't think that's a big deal. I think this is a good change, as while I really haven't had the time to watch the contenders and see what Taro Cookie can do, I believe having the flexibility of having two available hitscan players will be a boon to the Hunters. And finally, both the Guangzhou Charge and the London Spitfire have added a new coach to their team, while the San Francisco Shock have removed an assistant coach from the roster. And as I don't talk about coaching changes apart from announcing them, that's all I've got to say. Starting off in the East Division, let's go back a week and look at the knockouts between the top four teams to determine which two teams got to play in the final tournament. The teams playing were the first-ranked Hangzhou Spark versus the fourth-ranked New York Excelsior, and the second-ranked Shanghai Dragons facing off against the third-ranked Seoul Dynasty. And oh boy, did I get this one very wrong. So before the knockout started, I predicted that the Spark and the Dynasty would be the teams moving on, with the Spark defeating New York 3-1, and a close match between the Dynasty and the Dragons, with Seoul edging out Shanghai 3-2. That didn't happen. The Spark were upset by a surprisingly good New York team, with New York getting that 3-1 scoreline, while the Dynasty were dominated by the Shanghai Dragons 3-0. And with that, New York and Shanghai moved on. In the first game between the Hangzhou Spark and the New York Excelsior, the Spark got off to an early lead by taking the first map, but New York was able to battle back and win the next three. Like most of the East Division, neither of these teams really wanted to play that rush dive hybrid, the Winston Diva, Reaper Echo, Lucio Moria comp that is popular in the West, as New York was consistently playing Orisa, while the Spark loved to play Zarya in the double bubble. Ultimately, this was a good match. The Spark, especially Shy, looked great. But as Hangzhou was constantly playing dive, the double bubble style of dive, and New York liked playing more of the anti-dive comp with Flora on the McCree, the Spark ultimately faltered. Flora had an amazing game, and Jodak also did a lot of work on the BAP especially. So New York's defenses were too strong for the Spark, and the New York Excelsior completed the upset and made their way to the June Joust finals. On the other hand, the other game was a much different story. The Shanghai Dragons and the Seoul Dynasty competed once again to determine who would make it to the final tournament of the June Joust, just like they did in the May Melee, and the Dragons did not have much competition to secure their place, going 3-0 against the Dynasty. First of all, team comps. Seoul played nothing but double shield the entire match, and in the control map, they tried their hardest to play May. The Dragons also played a bit of double shield for a majority of the match, only switching to play Orisa Diva on Anubis defense. Now, the Dragons like to play double hit scam with Fleta on the soldier whenever they could. And this was not a close match. Seoul looked really outmatched, and while Fitz and Creative had good games, I always feel like the Dynasty overthink the game instead of just playing the things they're good at, like, gesture on the Winston. Seeing Prophet on the May as well for so long just kind of hurt. Prophet in general just seemed to have a quiet match, not really being able to find too much against the Dragon, which for such a good player is not a good sign for a match, but that's not to say anything against Prophet per se. It's just that Seoul constantly struggled to get any progress at all on all the maps, and it just showed how good Shanghai was playing. Shanghai's defenses were impenetrable. We saw the renaming of Lijiang Tower to Lijiang Tower with this impressive 10 environmentals in the two 100-0 rounds. We saw Fleta popping off to hold B for a very long time on Temple of Anubis, and we saw Void chime in to help full hold Seoul on Hollywood. I was disappointed in the performance from the Dynasty, but honestly, with how Shanghai looked, I don't think any team would have looked decent against how they played this match. Shanghai won decisively and moved on to the June Joust Finals. On the other side, in the West Division knockouts, the top 6 teams competed for 2 tickets to Hawaii to compete against New York and Shanghai. Now, these predictions I did a little bit better with. First of all, we had the 5th-ranked Dallas Fuel taking on the 4th-ranked Houston Outlaws, and what I thought would be a close match, 3-2 in favor of the Fuel, which would lead them to the 1st-ranked Los Angeles Gladiators, and what I predicted to be an upset 3-1 in favor of the Fuel, giving us the first West Division team. On the other end of the bracket, we had the 3rd-ranked Atlanta Reign fending off the 6th-ranked Boston Uprising, and what I predicted would be an easy match for the Reign, 3-1, leading Atlanta into a match with the 2nd-ranked San Francisco Shock, and what I thought would be a wipe of the Reign, with the Shock winning 3-0. But compared to reality, I didn't do too bad, but oh boy were none of these games close. Dallas did defeat both the Outlaws and the Gladiators, but Dallas did not have a close game at all against the Outlaws, winning 3-0, and I was right with the Gladiators taking a map off of the Fuel, losing 3-1. Now, on the other hand, Boston did not give Atlanta much trouble, losing 3-0 to the Reign, and the only prediction I actually got completely wrong was Atlanta Reign upsetting the Shock in a completely dominant fashion, 3-0. Now, for the sake of the length of the video, we're going to be a little bit more brief in the West knockouts. Starting with the Dallas Fuel's journey to Hawaii, their first opponent was the Houston Outlaws. For team comps, Dallas plays the Dive Rush hybrid, while the Outlaws tried to play more Orisa comps in the first 2 maps before nearly mirroring the Fuel in the dive, but playing Brig instead of Lucio. And ultimately, the team comp gave Dallas the win. The Fuel's dive was just too good, with Fielder doing so much work on the Moria that Houston never really looked fully in control. But still, the Outlaws did not look too bad, except for the Brig. That did not work at all when the Outlaws tried to mirror Dallas's dive. This was a pretty quick 3-0, and Dallas looked dominant. In fact, despite going up against the number 1 ranked team, the Gladiators, I don't think many people expected LA to win. The Gladiators were more willing to play the dive mirror than the Outlaws, although the Gladiators also like to play the Orisa Diva comps. And this one was a much closer match, even with the control map going to 3 points. One big highlight for the Gladiators was Mirror coming into the game on Hollywood to play Torp. And it worked. The Gladiators' more anti-dive style comp held Dallas, fully held them on Hollywood A to give LA their only map win in the match. But ultimately, good plays from the Gladiators was not good enough to stop Sparkle and Fielder, who both played incredibly. And Dallas once again returned to Hawaii. Now, on the other end of the bracket, we had the Atlanta Reign making an upset, taking out both the Boston Uprising and the San Francisco Shock 3-0. Atlanta really showed that they were full of surprises, as right out of the gates against Boston, Atlanta played dive. This is a team that made the Orisa Diva comp work in the West. They were one of the first and one of the best teams at that, playing, I believe, exclusively Orisa Diva. They then played dive. And it looked shaky at first. Boston exclusively plays dive, and they look pretty decent at it. The first point control, Atlanta took a while to get going, but by the second point, the Reign were in full control. Then Atlanta stopped playing the dive for the rest of the match and went back to the Orisa Diva. And honestly, Atlanta still looked strong. Good work from the DPS and Iris on the supports, but they definitely had some help from the Boston Uprising, as they were prone to forget about the point, either with C9s or just not pushing the payload, making some of the team fights worthless. Still, despite that, Boston didn't look too bad. Atlanta just looked better and moved on to take on the number 2 seed, the San Francisco Shock. And this is where Atlanta really shined, as the Shock were outmatched. And that's saying something. Again, Atlanta showed strength and flexibility, playing 3 different comps, the Dive, Orisa Diva, and Double Shield, while the Shock either played Dive or Double Shield. Atlanta were really good in this match, shutting down Violet on the Moria and preventing the Shock from getting value out of their coalescences. Pelican and Kai did a lot of work for Atlanta, and Hawk too. The Shock just couldn't make progress, and despite some help on Hollywood with Atlanta C9ing a couple of times, the Shock just couldn't break through Atlanta's defenses. And I have to say, I hate seeing the Shock play How to Murder defense, as their setup on A has been broken so many times so easily during the June Joust, which always gives their opponents a lot of time on B. Atlanta took advantage of that this time. I highlighted this when the Shock played Toronto Defiant, and they did pretty much the same thing in this match, and Atlanta did what the Defiant did. They took A so quickly that they had a 4-minute time bank after snowballing on B. But I digress. Atlanta looked unstoppable in the knockouts, and were the second team to be sent to Hawaii to take on the East Division. And moving on to this past week's games, the double elimination tournament of the June Joust, featuring the New York Excelsior, Shanghai Dragons, Atlanta Reign, and the Dallas Fuel. This was a quick one until the grand finals, which went all the way. Now, I made my pick'ems and predictions after the knockouts, but before the finals began, and I wasn't too far off. The first games were the East Division's number 2 seed, the New York Excelsior, against the West Division's number 1 seed, the Atlanta Reign, and the East number 1 seed, the Shanghai Dragon, against the West number 2 seed, the Dallas Fuel. And I predicted victory for the West, with Atlanta and Dallas defeating New York and Shanghai respectively 3-1. This leads to the winners' finals, where the Reign taking on the Fuel, which I predicted to be a close game going the way in the Fuel 3-2. Back in the losers bracket, we had the Shanghai Dragons taking on the NYXL, and I thought that the Dragons would have little trouble moving on, defeating New York 3-1, leading the Dragons to take on Atlanta, and this is where my predictions start going awry. I predicted a close game between Shanghai and Atlanta, with Atlanta winning 3-2 and heading into a rematch against the Fuel in the grand finals, with Dallas taking it all in a 4-2 victory. However, as it happened, the games were not that close until the grand finals. The West did find victory in the winners' semifinals, with Atlanta and Dallas winning 3-0 against New York and Shanghai respectively, and Dallas did defeat Atlanta, but in a much more decisive 3-1. In the losers' semifinals, the Shanghai Dragons easily defeated New York 3-0 before ruining my predictions and defeating Atlanta 3-0, giving us the Dallas-Shanghai in the grand finals. The grand finals were the first close games, going all the way to 4-3 and giving us our new champions of the June Joust, the Shanghai Dragons. Now, we're going to go over each game individually, and starting with the New York Excelsior against the Atlanta Reign, this game was not terribly close, but not many games in the June Joust finals were. Atlanta played both the Dive and Orisa comps, playing both of a little Double Shield and much more of their signature Orisa Diva. New York, on the other hand, were a little bit more confusing, playing both Dive and Double Shield, but playing Double Shield when their Dive was working better on a map. Specifically Temple of Anubis, where New York had a good attack playing Dive, but when it came down to the Time Bank attack, they decided to play Double Shield for some reason, and got full hold. Still, New York's dive comp was not nearly as good as Atlanta's, and when Atlanta switched to the heavy anti-dive style with the Torb, New York just could not do anything. All in all, New York looked out of sorts, and while Flora is very good, it's a close word, his Hanzo was not that impressive, especially his ult. Atlanta, on the other hand, looked comfortable in this match with the DPS doing a lot of work. Pelican, in particular, continues to look like one of the best echoes in the league. Atlanta takes a relatively easy 3-0 match and moves on while New York drops to the lower bracket. The next game between the Dallas Fuel and the Shanghai Dragons was also not close. However, we saw the beginning of the strength of the Dragons as they came out playing something unique, Ball Dive. Now, this comp is still the standard Rush Dive style hybrid, with the heroes most of the times, the Reaper, Echo, Lucio Moria, and Diva, but with a Wrecking Ball instead of Winston. In this match, it did not work out too well, and so Shanghai did switch to some Orisa Diva and True Dive comps at times, and Dallas just continuously plays the dive. And the Fuels Dive was great. Shanghai did try to play the double hit scan at times, and it just wouldn't work, so Shanghai would also try the anti-dive toward Reaper, and that wouldn't work too well either, but it was still better. Shanghai just wasn't sure how to counter Dallas, and they kept switching and trying new things. And this isn't to say that Shanghai looked bad, just that Dallas looked better. Lip did a lot of work on McCree, and Shanghai did look a lot better when they mirrored the dive, but Dallas's positioning and clutch potential, plus Sparkle's flexibility on the Genji and Doomfist, carried Dallas to the winners finals with a 3-0, sending Shanghai down with New York. Moving on to the winners finals, between Dallas and Atlanta, we saw a bit more of a competitive match here, with Atlanta matching Dallas's dive comp most of the time, only moving over to the Orisa Diva on Volskaya for part of the time. And despite the 3-1 scoreline, this game was actually really close. Control on Nepal went to 3, with the first point going mostly in favor of Atlanta, the second mostly in favor of Dallas, and the third one really going back and forth the entire time. Atlanta won that map, by the way. That was their one map they won. One big thing we saw from Atlanta in this match was the substitutions. Atlanta would play Edison when they wanted to match the dive, as Edison is their main Reaper player. And when Atlanta wanted to play more Orisa Diva comps, they would bring in Kai, who's more of that hit scan. This is typically a concern because if the Orisa comp is not working, switching to dive for most teams would be typically putting a sub player on a role he's not really comfortable on. Kai, however, did play the Reaper and in the dive when the Orisa comp was not working. And while I'm not going to say that he looked fantastic on the role, he did well enough. He did his job well enough. But overall, the Atlanta range just looked great throughout the match, but Dallas looked better. And were able to get good picks, slightly faster ults, and just clutch plays all around, giving Dallas the 3-1 victory and sending Atlanta to the losers bracket. And back to the losers bracket we go, as Shanghai's first step to the grand finals was defeating New York. And back we go to the one-sided matches. Shanghai continued to play the ball dive, with a bit of Orisa Diva mixed in, while New York was exclusively playing the dive. But this time for New York, we saw Ivy instead of Flora, and it looked a little bit better, but it didn't help much. This was a very one-sided game that saw some bad ults from both sides with a Bustio and a duplicated Lucio on the same point of Busan. Now, some good plays from Ivy, especially on the Doomfist, gave New York a fighting chance, but Shanghai had New York pinned down with the ball dive, and the anti-dive comps, they eliminated New York from the June Joust 3-0 and moved on to face Atlanta. And again, this Atlanta-Shanghai game was fairly one-sided, but not as much as the New York-Shanghai game. Both of these teams played a variety of comps, with both of them playing the dive, Orisa Diva, ball dive, and double shield at various points in the match. But in all honesty, this was also a decently close match. Shanghai constantly just shut Atlanta out. Atlanta just could not finish the fights well enough to get wins. There was a lot of overtime captures by Atlanta, including one on Hanamura that I want to point out. It was a finish with literally 0.2 seconds left. So they did get another attack, but I believe they did not get a tick, and Shanghai was able to get the tick and win the map fairly easily. Overtime takes are usually not good, as Shanghai typically had a lot of time to get that time bank tick and just win, and that's usually what happened. Lots of clutch plays from Izzyaki and Lip, plus good neutral fight picks, and despite a good showing from Pelican and Edison on the Reign, the Shanghai Dragons were able to dispose of the Atlanta Reign 3-0 and move on to the rematch with Dallas in the Grand Finals. And the Grand Finals, what a Grand Finals it was. This one went the distance. Wow, I can speak, I swear. Now we're going to go over this one map by map, because why not? So starting off on Lijiang Tower, Dallas played dive, Shanghai played ball dive. This map saw so many fights that just took forever. The first point was like 3 fights before it was over. I think there was just 3 fights. And some great ults from there was super back and forth, but Dallas always looked consistently in control. Some great ults from Sparkle. Always throughout this match getting work done on the Diva dupes, usually getting at least 1 or 2 picks with his ults. Fearless also punished Lee Jae-gong, stopping the Lucio player from getting his beat off with the use of Primal Rage. And that was something we saw a lot in this match. I think 3 or 4 times over the course of the 7 maps. Lee Jae-gong got the beat canceled while casting it. So Dallas took the first point, and this starts to look one-sided, especially after Shanghai struggles on offense in Volskaya, the next map in the series. Dallas's dive was just too much for the ball dive defense of Shanghai, and on offense, Dallas's defense was too much, and despite the anti-dive Orisa comp that Shanghai tried to use on attack, they get full held, giving Dallas a 2-0 lead. Now, next off to Numbani, where Shanghai plays nothing but the ball dive. And this is a trend that we're going to see for the remainder of the match. Shanghai is starting to look better on defense with good disengages to let single picks turn into ticks rather than team wipes, which would lead to the point being taken. And Shanghai gets a good stop, while on offense managing to barely push the cart to victory. This map was not a dominant showing from Shanghai, but rather a look of mortality for Dallas. Heading next to Rialto, Fate on the Wrecking Ball starts to do a lot more work. But it was actually Void who had an amazing 5k Diva Bomb, which gave Shanghai the full complete. Dallas, on the other hand, is starting to rely on clutch plays to get them the full caps, but with less time than Shanghai. Sparkle, however, puts on his carry pants, and he gives Dallas a good push in overtime, and Dallas managed to get the cart past A in time bank, with only having a minute to start to do so. So Dallas then takes a really aggressive defense, and it actually pays off, giving Fuel the point and putting this into match point 3-1. Now continuing on to Busan, Shanghai really started to show the strength of their ball dive comp. Which, reminder, they didn't really start playing this until the final tournament began. We saw them playing mostly the Orisa Diva comps, or double shield comps. Fate's Wrecking Ball started to give Dallas a lot more trouble beginning in this map, as Fate loved to pressure the point, and Dallas's comp wants to kind of be the aggressors and not be as defensive, so that was putting them into bad positions. We also started seeing some mistakes from Dallas's backline, getting a little too aggressive and being punished for it. Shanghai manages to edge Dallas out of the 3-point control map and start making this series, it was a 3-point control map, by which I mean it went all 3 points. And they start making this a series 3-2. Next up, Eichenwald. Fate continued to harass Dallas and caused a lot of issues, putting Dallas in uncomfortable positions and generally forcing the Fuel to play different than they wanted. But still, Dallas nearly fully hold the Dragons on A, but then some clutch plays by the Dragons gave them A, and through the rest of the map, completing in overtime with some help of Fletta's Soldier. Fletta does like to go to the Soldier for those clutch potential picks, as well as the Bastion, which we saw later in this map, in fact. Dallas, however, looked a lot more in control on A, taking that point very quickly before being stonewalled at B, which even forced Fearless to switch off of the Winston to the Roadhog to deal with Fate. This is when things started looking bad for the Dallas Fuel. And eventually the clutch factor did pull through, heavily due to Sparkle, and they got the payload to C before being stopped just before completing, in part due to Fletta's Bastion, and tying up the series 3-3. And finally, to Junkertown, where the worst thing for Dallas happened. They switched comps to play the ball dive. Fearless mirroring Fate's Wrecking Ball might not seem like a big deal, but it really is. It's a concession that the comp Dallas was running, their dive, which they had been running the entire month pretty much exclusively, was no longer working. And that's bad. That's a really bad sign for a team. But not everything was doing great for Shanghai either, as the supports were having a lot of issues ulting, dying while they were ulting, or just getting ineffective ults off, and that's in part due to the effectiveness of Dallas. On the Lip also was having some troubles, not doing all that well at times, and kind of feeding at times. On the other hand, the Dallas supports were doing really well. Both Jeske and Fielder were doing work with their ults, and Jeske for specifically was getting great boops on Fates, preventing pile driver damage. and just good plays by Jesuke. I have to give him props in this match. Shanghai was finally stopped midway through C, but with a great A defense, killed a lot of time for Dallas Fuel, and they struggled to push the point through B in overtime. Despite great work from Sparkle, who constantly throughout this match looked like a clutch player, he did so much work the entire time. Lip was able to finish off the Fuel with a really good ult, and the Shanghai Dragons, the reverse swept. Well, technically not. It's not a reverse sweep, but it basically was, and defeated the Dallas Fuel 4-3 to be the champions of the June Joust. And with that, the June Joust is completed, and the season is about halfway done. This meta was a bit of a one-sided affair most of the time, and with the Summer Showdown on the horizon, things may be different as there are no hero pools this next month. However, we'll probably see a lot of the same types of comps, maybe with some teams opting for the Rhine Rush, probably on specific maps, but it's really hard to tell. One thing's for sure, there will be no weekly recap next Wednesday, or let's be honest, next Thursday or Friday, as there are no games this weekend. Rather, the recap will return on June 30th, assuming I can get the video up on time. And with that, I do want to thank you for watching. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoyed this look at the June Joust, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!